Imagine the world as it would have appeared before the emergence of life as we think of it. Now consider what this world might have sounded like. There would be no electronic sounds, naturally, which are so common in our day-to-day lives. No sounds of machinery, no human voices, no singing or music, not even the slightest animal sound or the rustling of leaves. In fact, as there was no one there to hear it, we might even go so far as to say there was no sound at all. The 8th century Indian sage, Sri Adi Shankara, posed the question, if no one is seeing it, will the sky still be blue? Now this may be one of the oldest variants of the more modern, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? In the case of the colour blue, a colour as we experience it is a result of us interacting with the world through sense perception. Without an observer, even if there may still be electromagnetic waves happening out there in the world, there is no experience of the colour blue. So there isn't what we mean when we use the word blue. And so we can see that things are perhaps not quite as straightforward as we first thought. Now these questions don't necessarily have a specific answer. There are many ways that they can be approached. And if anything, their value lies more in introducing a sudden doubt, which then allows us to reflect on the nature of our perception. So when someone answers, of course the tree makes a sound, essentially they're approaching the question empirically, as if it were asking, did this event happen? And they're saying that, yes, the measurable phenomena associated with the experience of sound were present, what, in the abstract, we call sound waves. But that isn't really what we mean when we talk about sounds, is it? The sound waves are not the experience of sound. A sound is simply what it is, the way a stone sounds when you drop it in water, for example, or the way a string sounds when it is plucked. And there are few things that really convey the physicality of an object the way that the sounds it produces do. This is why sound is such an important part of film and TV. The experience of sound, the way that sound sounds, arises whole in the moment, undivided and irreducible. It is something that undeniably occurs, as irreducibly real as those movements of particles associated with it that we measure with our equipment, and perhaps even more so. But let's imagine that we could hear what this ancient world would have sounded like. The ebb and flow of the mineral world, flowing rivers, crashing volcanoes, torrential rains. And in other moments, almost completely silent. The silence of deserts. But over time, things changed. We all know how the story goes. Somewhere in the depths of the primordial ocean, life emerged. And gradually, over the course of billions of years, it spread across the planet, taking over the land and populating the skies. New sounds emerged, and now the world sounded very different. Now, what is it that is particular about these sounds? They're in some way different from the sounds of the mineral world. They're populated with tones and rhythmic pulsating patterns. In other words, they are structured according to symmetries and repeating patterns, which in effect are the same thing. The earlier sounds that we heard are described in technical terms as noises. Now, it's unfortunate that in common usage the word noise carries a negative connotation, because many of these sounds are in fact very beautiful. What is meant technically by the word is that the sound does not have a form that can be described in simple mathematical terms. It isn't made up of predictable repeating patterns, but rather a chaotic statistical distribution of sound waves across the frequency spectrum. In mathematics, we call these kinds of patterns stochastic. You can think of this most simply as the randomness that lies at the core of the physical world. The randomness of flipping a coin, the randomness of the placement of pebbles that washed up on the shore, or the chaotic complexity of rock formations. When talking about sound, the easiest way that you can think of the difference between a noise or a collection of tones, in the sense that we're talking about here, is not so much as distinguishing whether a sound is pleasant or not, but more like whether you can whistle its melody or clap its rhythm. The sound of rain can be quite pleasant, but you can't really sing its melody or clap its rhythm. The different qualities that these different kinds of sounds have give each its own unique beauty. The sounds of the mineral world appear to humans almost distant, impersonal. In the words of Milan Kundera, they approach us from the outside. Their stark beauty and unfeeling quality speaks of the voidless enormity of geological eras. Their forms seem as inevitable as the passage of time. If we spend a long time listening to them, we gradually start to disappear. Instead of residing within ourselves, we gaze outward. We could liken this to the feeling you might get when visiting the Grand Canyon and getting lost marveling at its infinite forms. The sounds of the animal world are definitely something closer to us. They speak of intention and movement and of life and activity, and yet they are at the same time somewhat alien and strange. They have an almost primordial beauty, like the awakening of some very ancient animal instinct. Music draws nearer still. It's like an interior sound, a personal sound, a sound that comes from within humans. It is a sound that attempts to express a subjectivity out into the world around it. If the sounds of the mineral world are akin to seeing the Grand Canyon, then listening to music is similar to gazing deeply into a painting. Now, the symmetrical aspect that we mentioned when we were talking about the sounds of the animal world is not just a property of the sounds that animals produce. It's a property of the animals themselves and of life in general. Living organisms are formed in patterns that are the very expression of symmetry and repetition. Take, for example, the image of the caterpillar that I used for the cover of this episode. Its body is formed of repeating segments, organized along a bilateral symmetry. The form of the caterpillar has rhythm and symmetry, and rhythm and symmetry are in essence the same thing, because rhythm is simply symmetry in time, whereas we normally think of symmetry in space. If you have a repeating pulse and you were to imagine a dividing line falling on one of those pulses, then all the others would be moving away into the past and into the future at an equal rate in opposite directions. And life also displays a similar symmetry in time. Living organisms and cells have life cycles and lifespans which have a certain overall regularity. Cells grow, live, and die at certain rates. Organs pump in regular rhythms, waking and sleeping patterns alternate. Life is infused with rhythms and symmetries, and this tells us something about music, which is after all the expression of a living organism, and it's something that stretches back much further in time than even the earliest civilizations. Now, it is worth noting that much human music falls within certain tempos. Barring a few exceptions, music rarely goes faster than a certain speed or slower than a certain speed, and these tempos are in some way correlated to these living rhythms that we're talking about. There are certain perceptual limits to what we can hear as music. Too slow, and we're unable to group the sounds together meaningfully. Too fast, and we can no longer distinguish between the individual onsets of the different tones. They just blur into a single sound. The lower of these two limits is somewhere in the region of 30 beats per minute. For the upper limit, things are a bit trickier because it largely depends on how you subdivide your beat. But for anything above a few hundred beats per minute, we're no longer able to distinguish individual sounds. And in a few minutes, we'll be looking at what happens when we go beyond this limit. In addition to these perceptual limits, most of the music that humans make spontaneously, in other words, not maybe just someone trying to see how many thousand notes they can get a digital audio workstation to play in a second. Much of the music that comes most naturally to humans falls somewhere within the range of very primordial embodied rhythms, such as our heartbeat or the alternating rhythm of our footsteps when we walk or when we run. And the fact that these fundamental rhythms that accompany us throughout all our lives are of an alternating two-stroke pattern might have something to do with why, when we hear a steady beat with no variation, we still tend to mentally group the pulses into alternating, stronger and weaker beats. Now, a very tantalizing picture starts to emerge when we look at animals whose natural rhythms are very different from our own. Small flying birds like sparrows or thrushes have a resting heart rate of around 500 beats per minute. Let's say about 6 to 8 times faster than the average human, and they have a metabolism to match. Over the years, many naturalists and sound engineers alike have slowed down recordings of birdsong and found that when they're slowed to quote-unquote human time, patterns and phrases begin to emerge that initially appeared as a single sound or as fewer sounds because the constituent parts occurred too quickly for us to perceive them as individual events. Or we find that certain phrases, when slowed down, acquire a distinctly musical feel. The most famous example is likely the call of the veery thrush, because of how musical the result is. Here is its call as we normally hear it. And here it is slowed down. And even in less obviously musical examples, we still find rising and falling contours of tones emerging that make some sort of aesthetic sense when we hear them. If we go down this scale of tempos, past humans and down into the world of animals with slower metabolisms, we enter the world of large whales, whose songs appear almost like a series of disembodied drones hanging in the void. Once we're down at this speed, we're talking about animals whose heart beats only 8 or 10 times a minute, the equivalent of what a small bird might do in a second. And in fact, if we massively slow down recordings of birds, we end up with, well, actually the exact sounds you're hearing right now. These aren't actually recordings of whales. It's just the call of a humble blackbird, but played back very slowly, and with some water sounds added for effect. Conversely, if we take actual recordings of humpback whales and speed them up, we find that patterns and phrasings that were more spread apart start to become more evident. Here, for example, the alternating rhythmic interplay of two different types of call is immediately apparent. And many of the sounds that emerge, just as the blackbird sounded like a whale when we slowed it down, these sped-up whale calls start to sound an awful lot like birdsong. So you can hear that as we move through timescales, sounds that at first seemed quite different appear much more closely related. As you can imagine, these kinds of observations have led researchers to wonder whether these animals have a different relationship with time than we do. Certainly our human music must sound very different to them than it does to us. This is tied up with an idea that is known as the perceptual present. And this is the idea that the present moment that we perceive isn't an infinitely small pinpoint in time, but rather more like the circle of light projected by a torch, which has dimensions and does not have a precise limit. It blurs at the edges. And as this light moves through time, things become visible and other things fade away. Within the perceptual present, we can make sense of how elements relate to each other, such as in a melody. If all our experience was merely a succession of infinitely small points in time, we likely wouldn't be able to make sense of things like melodies. Experimental data suggests that for humans, the perceptual present is somewhere in the region of 3 seconds or so. And this is something that we all have an understanding of at an instinctual level. It's what we call a moment, which is a vague unit of time that is definitely not so incredibly brief that you're not aware of it, but it also doesn't last for more than a few seconds. The idea then here is that different animals might have a longer or a shorter perceptual present, and therefore a very different experience of time. Now, these symmetrical patterns we have been looking at in the animal world are not disconnected from the previous chaotic and stochastic patterns of the mineral world. In fact, they emerge out of that very same rippling randomness. These rhythms have a liquidity to them. They're not perfectly mechanical. There is a softness and a wetness to them, and there is variation within them. It's often said that every fingerprint or every snowflake is unique, but this is not a special property of fingerprints or snowflakes. This is a property of everything in nature. Every eye is unique, every mouth is unique, every sound is unique, every leaf, tree, or rock. Nothing ever quite repeats exactly the same. These forms emerge out of a shifting, subtle, ever-present randomness. And so they have a certain spontaneity, a fluidity, and a creativity. And in fact, we can create quite abstract sounds that have qualities that make them sound like they might be produced by living organisms if we introduce internal symmetries and rhythms into patterns of resonant tones, and we blend these with very subtle stochastic variations. This sample is from a longer piece that I worked on some time ago, The Emptiness of Sound, which I'll link to in the description. And these particular sounds which you can hear now are not recorded. They're created entirely digitally from scratch. An even more extreme example is this very abstract clip from something that I'm working on right now. It doesn't really sound like anything you might hear in the real world, and yet it still sounds like it might be the kind of sound that would be made by something that's living. Although it's quite hard to imagine what kind of a mouth or similar cavity an animal would have to possess to produce such a sound. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that I work on seems to fall somewhere between music and sound in a more expanded sense. And I'm not going to get into discussions right now about what is or isn't music. There are as many definitions as there are people, and it's largely a matter of how people define the word based on what it is that they're trying to say and what distinctions it is useful to make within the context that they're talking in. Now, in the sounds of the animal world, we find what are often described as the building blocks of music, rhythms, tones, and harmonies. And these can be understood in a way to all be the same sort of thing. They are repeating symmetries in time. The only difference is the speed at which they occur. If we start with a series of audible clicks repeated at a steady rate, we perceive this as a rhythm. In fact, it's the simplest rhythm we can think of, a pulse. Now, if we take this pulse and start to speed it up, we eventually no longer hear the individual beats, but rather a continuous tone. And we start to perceive changes in the speed of the pulsation as changes in pitch. When it speeds up, it goes up in pitch. When it slows down, it goes down in pitch. Now, we can extend this example of how rhythmic patterns and tones are related to begin to consider the rudiments of harmony too. Now that we have this tone that we've created out of a series of beats, if we play the same pattern alongside it, but repeating at twice the speed, we get a second tone an octave higher, a ratio of 2 to 1. If we start again with the same pulsation and play alongside it a second beat at 3/2 the speed, so a ratio of 3/2, the rhythm sounds something like this. When these two are sped up, we get the first tone and the second tone forming the interval of the perfect fifth. We can do the same with a ratio of 3/4, and we get the perfect fourth. And we can continue in this way all the way down the Pythagorean intervals. And each time the rhythm gets gradually more complex, and this is correlated with harmonic complexity. The more discernible the rhythmic pattern between them, the more harmonic the two resultant tones sound to us. Rhythmical unity maps onto harmonic unity. If we start from a very complicated polyrhythm or polychrony, where it is more difficult for us to pick out where the rhythm repeats and what its overall structure is, then we find equally that the resulting tones sound quite dissonant together. If we push this example even further and do the same thing but with a random set of beats that are not organized into regular pattern, then we end up with a more noisy signal. There's quite a good video about this on YouTube by Adam Neely at the Ableton Loop in Berlin, I believe, where he gives a lot of these examples and others as well and goes into a bit more depth about this. So I'll link to that one in the description as well. Now, as you can see from these examples, there is no specific division or moment in which a sound transforms from rhythm to tone and vice versa. It's a matter of perception. Remember the examples we heard of animal sounds occurring at vastly different speeds and the different things that we could perceive at different speeds. All of these phenomena, rhythm, tones, harmonies, arise out of symmetries in time. And this is something that was already understood among some of the earliest civilizations, albeit in different terms perhaps. So we can start to see why, in the ancient world, music was described by philosophers and scholars as a geometry of time, and they studied it as a science. This is an understanding of music which persisted in the West largely up until the 17th century, and only began to fade with the rise of the Enlightenment and what is sometimes called the disenchantment of the West. And its profound influence on the history of thought still has an impact today in some of the fundamental ways in which we think about music, and even how we think about the world around us in general. But we'll talk more about this in later episodes. Now, the other great important change that occurs over this time with the advent of animals and other living organisms is the coming into existence of ears and tympanic membranes and consciousnesses able to perceive and ascribe significance to sound. Now there was someone to hear the tree fall in the forest. Without the coming into existence of these things, there would be no music, there would be no sound experience, and we would have nothing to talk about here. And out of these animals, there came at least one animal that we know of for certain so far that had an interior sound, a sound that comes from within. From within what? Well, that's harder to say. And in this animal, there was a need to express this sound, to make it manifest in the world around it, to make the outside world more similar to the interior world that was growing within it. And in expressing this sound, it transformed it and developed it and invented 1,000 different forms and came to call it music. Now, this is one way of telling the story of what music is to humans, and we'll be looking at many others across cultures and across time, and each will help to illuminate or understand a different aspect of music. And this is, after all, what histories are. They're collections of stories that tell us what things mean to us and to other humans. And this essentially concludes our topic for today. But maybe I should take a moment to give you an idea of what we'll be talking about. This history of music is going to be my focus for this channel for the foreseeable future. Now, it's going to take me a while, a few years probably, to go all the way from the origins up to modern times. And this is also because the scope is going to be quite broad. I've often found that histories of music tend to largely focus on music theory and on notated and recorded music. Now, there's a very simple reason for this. Music that is notated or recorded, or music that theories are written about, is, by virtue of this very fact, much better documented. And so there's a lot more information going around on it. We encounter it much more often, and it's easier to write about. And of course, we will also be talking about these things in this history, the theories, the notation, recording processes, because these have had a huge impact on the music of the modern world. But we will also be talking about much more than that, very ancient forms of music, or understandings of music that are very different from the ones that we have in the modern West. Music theory and notation are, in a sense, a shadow of music. Humans have been making music for tens or probably even hundreds of thousands of years before any kind of way of writing it down existed. Music is just something that humans do, just as plants flower and trees bear fruit. So we will be trying to look at music in a much more expanded sense. It's so commonplace for us now to have music recordings and notations that mean that we can play pieces of music over and over again, almost exactly in the same way. But for the majority of human existence, this wasn't the case. Music was fleeting and profound. We're, in a sense, living in a musical bubble when compared to the larger history of human beings. Take, for instance, this quote by Isidorus of Seville, who was a scholar and archbishop writing in the early Middle Ages. He says, "Since sound is a thing of sense, it passes along into past time, and it is impressed on the memory. From this it was pretended by the poets that the Muses were the daughters of Jupiter and memory. For unless sounds are held in memory by man, they perish, because they cannot be written down." Now consider how this changes our relationship to music. Even in a pre-literate society, once you've made a painting or a sculpture, it's there for all to see, for as long as it's preserved. You can touch it. But music, the moment you stop playing it, it quickly fades into the past. Or as Alan Watts put it, much better than I can, it echoes away through the corridors of the mind, which we call memory. But anyway, this is just to give you a little taste of some of the things that we'll be getting into, and we'll have plenty of time to go much more deeply into all of this. And I've also added a link in the description to my archive where you can download an audio version of this episode if you are so inclined. With that said, I'll be seeing you next time. Or I guess you'll be hearing me. You know what I mean.